Yes.
Mr. Speaker, on Sunday I had the unusual experience of sitting in the classroom that I occupied at St Patrick's School in South Dunedin when I was an 8-year-old. And I was there with my own 8-year-old, and of course it was a somewhat nostalgic experience where I recalled the 30 or so classmates that were there, and they had a particular feature in common. They were all but one Pākehā, and one of them was a Maori. But on Sunday, the similar number of kids that were in this former classroom, it's now community hall, came from all over the world. They were from Vietnam, the UK, Malaysia, the Philippines, Samoa, Tonga, China, and possibly many others that I don't recall. Kiwis, every one of them. They had different food preferences. We had a potluck lunch, and obviously there were slight differences in clothing, but they were Kiwis. And I think our daughters will grow up in a country, my daughters and Amanda's daughters will grow up in a country that is much more diverse, much more colourful, more tolerant, and ultimately more enjoyable. So it's incredibly disappointing for me to listen to the discourse that has been going on after an oblique reference in the budget documents to a Treasury comment that said that net migration was strongly positive, and the people in this House, unfortunately, but also in the media, that are describing that as some kind of migration explosion. And even more so, I think members of the New Zealand First Party, and I see Dennis O'Rourke is one of the perpetrators, who have engaged in some disgraceful comments and speeches in this House, and taking the opportunity to talk about the they, that somehow there is a peril at work in New Zealand and it needs to be stopped because they are taking our jobs and they are taking our houses. And I think that is really disappointing and disgraceful. But actually, the people that I'm most disappointed about are Labour, because their leader has engaged in a very subtle dog whistle to a small coterie of New Zealanders for whom the xenophobic message will still resonate. And it was subtle.
Order. Interjections will be rare and reasonable.
He said that they support migration. They just need to somehow control it, although Phil Twyford overreached by saying that a net positive inflow of no more than 5,000 to 10,000 was the goal. Well, because Kiwis aren't leaving, that must have caused members like Chris Whāwhoi and Raymond Ho and even Ms Lole Taylor to cause some serious disquiet, because what that would mean in practice is no more family reunification, no more partnerships, no more students coming and studying at our universities for years at a time. No even, and I'm not sure who it is who's the economic development spokesman for Labour at the moment, but that person must be worried as well, because skilled migration is very important. The Canterbury MPs must be worried if that sort of policy is adopted, because they know their region needs to be built. And Poto Williams is right. We do need to put our Kiwis at the front of the queue for those jobs. Point of order, Mr. Speaker. Point of order.
Point of order. A point of order. Michael Woodhouse.
I accept the comment that you've made about rare and reasonable, but I can no longer hear myself think with those interventions.
Yeah, I'm going to uphold that. Look, this is a robust debate and interjections are permissible, but continually calling out and incessantly is not acceptable, and the member will desist from that. Michael Woodhouse.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I think that would really worry the Canterbury MPs, because we know that while the important thing is to get as many Kiwis in the rebuild as we can, there is no doubt that in order for that to be effective and to create the great city that it can be again, we will need, and already are, relying on foreign migrant labour. So the dog whistle is really unfortunate, it's inappropriate, and it's unbecoming of this House, particularly when the net migration story had nothing to do with migrants. It had everything to do with Kiwis coming home and not leaving. And Prime Minister Key, when Leader of the Opposition, stood at the Westpac Stadium, which was a very good metaphor for the number of New Zealanders leaving under Labour, and said, we'll bring them home. Now, the number of people, well, I'll come to that, Mr. Goff. I'll come to that. You've made the point. They started in the Westpac Stadium. Now the number of people leaving this country you'd fit into the backbench of bar and cafe, and by the end of this year you could probably fit them in a phone booth in Molesworth Street. They've stopped leaving, they're coming home. And I hate to let the facts get in the way of a good rant by Mr Goff. And I dropped my glasses. Here is what I will tell him about the residence program. Since 2005-06, when under Labor, the residence visas granted exceeded 50,000. Well, last year they were under 40,000. There was a gross 20% reduction in the number of residence visas that were granted, and here's why. A migration policy is a demand-driven policy. Still can't hear myself think, Mr Speaker. Is a demand-driven policy. It's self-correcting in the medium term. If we have fewer New Zealanders leaving and more New Zealanders coming home, then the demand for those skills will be reduced, and therefore the numbers of migrants coming in will drop. And that's exactly what's happened, albeit that I note that there has been an increase in the number of working holiday makers and in the number of students now after a reduction. But I absolutely reject this migration explosion that has dominated the media over the last few days. It is very unbecoming of members of New Zealand First like Mr O'Rourke and Mr Williams to create that dog whistle to that small group of disaffected New Zealanders who think that's a problem. Now, let's talk about housing. And I can tell you that in Central Otago we are short of horticulture workers. Well, the whole Labour caucus could go to Alexandra because they would be the best cherry pickers I've ever heard, Mr Speaker. They're cherry picking all of the worst bits about housing. But let me tell the House about housing affordability under Labour. And I'm not talking about the last Labour government. I used to work at the National Bank, and in the 1980s, when the fourth Labour government was in power, I was issuing mortgages. The A mortgage was 17.5%. The B mortgage was 21.5%. That was the majority that we gave out. And why would people take mortgages at 21.5%? Because they were confident that house price inflation under Labour would continue to exceed the cost of the borrowing. That's exactly what we had in the 80s. We had it in the 2000s, and we'll have it again if that party ever comes close to the Treasury benches, Mr Speaker, because you cannot wish interest rates down. It's simply not possible. What keeps interest rates lower for longer is prudent spending, responsible fiscal management, and no pie-in-the-sky monetary policy which wishes interest rates down and takes away the choices of New Zealanders to decide whether they want to save, spend or invest in KiwiSaver is going to do that. Yes, there is a housing affordability issue. It's an issue that was 30% better under this government than it was when Labour was in power. So the members can cherry-pick all the data they like, because what a recent report for Treasury on the issue of migration and its effects on New Zealand's economy, in saying that there were positive effects of net migration, said, yes, housing affordability is an issue, but the predominant reason for house price inflation is supply-side inelasticity. That's a pointy-headed way of saying we don't have enough. And we need to build more. And again, I say to Labour, one could wish 100,000 houses into existence, but that does not make it happen. What makes it happen is freeing up land, reducing the burden of resource compliance, the development levies, yes, the building costs. And they can criticise all they like at the 3,500 saving, but it is stacks on the mill. It is one issue at a time. And this was a budget that delivered very, very good policies which will keep interest rates lower for longer, control spending, increase the value of the services that our government agencies provide to members of the public. It will help rebuild Canterbury. It will improve our education. It will improve our health. And it was all done on a reasonably modest increase in the vote. And I think that's what New Zealanders are looking for, Mr Speaker. That's what they've had to do, that's what they continue to do, and that's what this government will do. And I look forward to debating any one of those issues on the hustings in the next few months. This is a really good bill and I commend it.
Dennis O'Rourke.
Mr Speaker, the Prime Minister says there is no